Thanks very much. You're all good to come out instead of running the marathon. This is a marathon subject, if you will, and the challenges of the economic challenges of globalization are really a political story as much as an economic story. And at the heart of this is the effect of globalization on labor markets. And one can take several different cuts at this topic. For 30 years before the great crash of 2008, jobs were becoming more precarious, income was becoming more unequal, and this raises the fascinating question, which our next speaker, our first speaker, will address, namely, to what extent can this be understood as a consequence of globalization? The widening income inequality, the fact that workers are getting less and less of the fruits of their own productivity. And I think, if I may, you can understand this in a number of ways. The most direct, of course, is the impact of trade, but then indirectly, globalization undermines the managed form of capitalism of the sort that we had during the 30 years after the New Deal. And it undermines the politics of managed capitalism by giving capital increased political power at the expense of working people. So I know of no better person to unpack all of this and explain how globalization has affected labor than my friend Robert Pollin. Bob is the co-director of PERI, the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst, where he's also a professor of economics. His research centers on macroeconomics, conditions of low-wage workers in the United States and globally, the analysis of financial markets, as well as, importantly, the economics of building a clean energy economy in the United States. He co-authored the report's Job Opportunities for the Green Economy and Green Recovery, exploring the broader economic benefits of large-scale investments in a clean energy economy. Internationally, Bob has worked with the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, and the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa. Domestically, he's worked with the Joint Economic Committee of the United States, among other things, and his recent book is Back to Full Employment from MIT Press. So, Robert Pollin, welcome to the Cambridge Forum.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Pat, and thank you all for coming on this summer day. The Boston Marathon, the Red Sox are playing, but we have important things to talk about, so I'm very happy to see you all here. I'm very happy to participate, along with the very distinguished panelists throughout the whole day. So the question that Pat asked me to focus on is globalization of labor, is a race to the bottom inevitable? Now, my answer is no, but it's going to take a few stabs and a few detours to get at why it isn't inevitable, but I think Pat's question captures the real huge challenge in trying to understand how a race to the bottom won't happen, does not have to happen, because the challenges are quite severe. So coming out of the Wall Street crash and Great Recession of 2008, 2009, as we all know, employment conditions, certainly in the United States and Europe, the other OECD countries, are worse than they have ever been since the 1930s. If you take the first 3 years of the Obama presidency, the first 3 full years, ending in this past January, the average rate of unemployment was 9% over 3 full years. Now it's gone down a bit since then, but to a significant degree only because people have stopped looking for work. They've dropped out of the labor force. That's the official rate of unemployment. If we take the broader official measure from the Labor Department, which includes people that are counted as underemployed and people that are, have dropped out temporarily, the official unemployment rate is more closer to 16%. That's about 25 million people. That's more than the entire population of the 10 biggest cities in the United States. That's the order of magnitude of the problem. Now, that resulted from the Great Recession, but as Bob said, we also have a much longer term problem. So that people like Bob Kuttner, Rob Scott, myself, others have been writing about something like an employment crisis for almost a generation, that the current situation that resulted from the recession is just compounding. The longer term situation is, if I can borrow a phrase from the person that I think is still the greatest theorist of employment conditions, somebody by the name of Karl Marx. Marx used the term reserve army of labor, masses of unemployed people. And what we've had over really the past 30 to 35 years is a massive expansion in the global reserve army of labor. That is, workers within the United States and other countries competing among each other for employment opportunities. And that problem can't be good for workers in the United States, because for the most part they're coming into this global reserve army at a higher pay scale, and that then means that they lose bargaining power, and that exerts downward pressure on their ability to bargain for good working conditions and higher wages. And that's really the crux of the longer term problem as regards the United States. And I'm going to focus on that because Pat asked me to speak only for 15 minutes, but I'll make some brief references to conditions for workers in poor countries as well. But let me focus on this longer term issue that I just referred to. I want to quote from an eminent person, more contemporary than Karl Marx. I'll read the quote, then I'll tell you who it's from. The quote is as follows. Economic history offers no example of a country that experienced long-term productivity growth without a roughly equal rise in real wages. That is, productivity goes up, the ability to produce things improves, and according to this observer, wages rise more or less, certainly over the long term, according to this observer, more or less in step with the rise in productivity. The person that wrote that is Paul Krugman. The article was in the Harvard Business Review in 1994. Now, let me just, because I don't have my PowerPoint, I'm feeling a little inadequate here. I was going to show you a picture, but I'll describe the picture. So the picture is as follows. What has happened since 1972? The last year, I shouldn't say the last year, the year in which 1973, 72, 73, when Richard Nixon was still president. The average real wage for workers in the United States who are non-supervisory workers, okay? The average real wage for a non-supervisory worker in the United States peaked in real dollars after accounting for inflation, adjusting for inflation. Peaked in 1972 and 1973. The average real wage for a non-supervisory worker expressed in 2011 dollars was about $21 an hour, okay? Now today, or as of 2011, the same thing, the average real wage for a non-supervisory worker in the United States was $19.47. So that we're talking now about something over a 40-year period. Over a 40-year period, the average real wage for a non-supervisory worker is 7% below what it was 40 years ago. I mean, I've actually been telling this story for a long time, but, I started out, I think I was telling it, for 20 years. Now it's 40 years. It's like my, my entire professional life. Now, the thing is that while that has happened, productivity has actually risen steadily. Now, or I shouldn't say steadily, it has risen. There's been periods when it's gone up faster, and there are periods when it's gone up slower, but it has always been rising. There hasn't been a single year from 1972 to the present in which productivity, the amount the average worker produces when she or he shows up at work and does things, how much they produce in the course of the day, how much that gets added up over the course of a year, average productivity has more than doubled since 1972. Indeed, and these are official statistics from the US Labor Department, average labor productivity is about 112% higher as of 2011 than it was in 1972. So here's the situation, that over the course of 40 years, what the average worker produces over the course of the day has more than doubled, more than doubled. The pie has more than doubled. At the same time, the amount that a worker brings home for producing twice as much as they did 40 years ago has been cut by 7%. So that's for the average worker. So this is a profound tendency. I think it reflects so much of what we are talking about in this country now, about the rise of inequality, about money moving to the top 1%, and so forth. And it is completely in contradiction, by the way, with what Krugman said. And Krugman, as we all know, is certainly, in the grand scheme of things, whatever you might think about his column or his books or whatever, in the grand scheme of things, he certainly is more on the progressive side than most economists. And true, he might have been a little bit different in his thinking in 1994, but in any case, the point is, what he was saying, he cannot think of any, and he is a very credible person, he won the Nobel Prize, he could not think of a single instance in world history in which a country experiences rising productivity growth, rising capacity to produce goods and services, which translates into rising capacity to increase income. He could not think of a single instance in history when this rise in productivity is not linked, at least over the long term, with a rise in real wages. And the fact is, we don't have to look into the deep depths of some obscure historical moment somewhere that in a place we've never heard of. It's actually been happening in this country for 40 years. That is, workers have been getting the shaft for 40 years in terms of not having their incomes rise as productivity rises. So their share of the pie has been shrinking, not every year, but for the most part for 40 years. And yes, this does explain a lot about the rise of inequality and the disparities between the 1% and the 99%, because if the pie is doubling, and if all the workers aren't getting any raise at all, then somebody has to be getting that extra income, and it's rising to the top. I should also add, though this is not the theme for today, having that income flow way disproportionately to the top also contributed to hyper-speculation in financial markets. Why? Because there's just so much more money around for the people to speculate on, and it also contributes to a slackening in market demand because working people, the people that are going to spend what they earn, aren't getting it. It's going up to the top so that the rich can hyper-speculate. Now, why is this happening? Well, there are a lot of different theories. There's debates, and Rob Scott and Bob Kuttner, I know, have participated in these debates, and I won't go through all the debates, but I want to reference one very useful article and the points made. And this is an article by Alan Blinder from Princeton University, who was he was vice chair of the Federal Reserve for a while. He was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors under Clinton and so forth. So also a very established figure. In 2006, he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs called Fear of Outsourcing. And what Blinder said was that what we're facing, and he didn't use Marxian terminology, you'd be surprised to hear, But he basically said we are experiencing massive expansion in the global reserve army of labor. And the way he put it was to say, we can think about two kinds of jobs within the US economy that can all be done elsewhere in the world now. One is every single manufacturing job. Doesn't mean it has to be done elsewhere, but could be done elsewhere. Okay, so the fact is that they can be done elsewhere, and whatever demand we have for these products could be shipped back to the United States. And the second, and even maybe larger component of this, was he said that we now, for the first time, have a situation in which a significant proportion of service jobs can be done elsewhere and sent back to the US via the internet. And he called these impersonal service sector jobs. So what are we referring to here? A lot of what we're referring to is kind of back office technical work, like medical analysis or engineering analysis or law firms or architectural firms. I know my own cousin has an small architectural firm in Washington, D.C., and he was approached by somebody who was, he said he can be an intermediary. You can get all the drawings done much more cheaply in Colombia, and then we just send you the drawings, and, if you don't like them, you get new drawings. But, you don't have to pay people what you pay them in the United States. So that's an example of the type of thing that Blinder was talking about. Now, Blinder said that, and this actually was after some debate. He adjusted his numbers. He said he thought between 20 to 30% of all jobs performed today within the United States could be performed perfectly fine by people in other countries. That's 30 to 40 million jobs in a labor force of about 150 million. Now, the point, and I don't think Blinder himself covers this part of the argument too much, but the point, I think, that is implicit at least, and anyway, I'll make it explicit, the point is not that all 30 to 40 million jobs are going to go to other countries, though some will. The point is that employers gain bargaining power because they can make a credible threat, not an empty threat, a credible threat to workers, to unions, to do-gooders who want a higher minimum wage, to say, fine, do whatever you want, we'll just move to China, okay? Yes, you want workers to get higher wages, we're going to relocate to Mexico, they can do the work perfectly fine for 1/10 the wage, or 1/40 the wage in China. And again, it doesn't mean that that is going to happen every time, but the fact is that it has changed the bargaining dynamics dramatically, such that workers do not have the same leverage, for the most part, that they did prior to this large expansion in the global reserve army of labor. I mean, this point has been recognized even by, among other people, Alan Greenspan in the 1990s, when what we had was very low unemployment rates, which I'm going to come to in a minute, briefly at the end of the 90s, and we had no inflationary pressure. Economic theory has told us for a generation that if you have low unemployment, it's going to drive up wages because workers increase bargaining power. Now, we did not see that. We did not see the bargaining power except for a brief moment that I will come to. But Greenspan was asked about this in 1997, and he said, workers feel insecure. Workers feel threatened. Workers do not have the same sense of security that they once did, and that therefore they aren't going to bargain up their wages. Now, and we don't have the same inflationary pressures. Greenspan was saying this actually as a positive, because he did not want to see wages go higher, but he was saying, therefore, I can keep monetary policy fairly loose, and we're not going to see the same inflationary pressures coming from workers. And I would also add that his view was endorsed by the person who is currently the vice chair of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, who is considered a very dovish, liberal member of the Fed. At that time, she made the same exact argument. So the point is that you have this idea of a credible threat that businesses could make and that exerts persistent downward pressure on wages. Okay, so how do we counter this? Because that's what the question is this a race to the bottom? And my answer was no, not necessarily. So the way to counter it is, well, first of all, it is politics, as Bob said. We have to begin with a commitment to full employment as a policy aim. Now, it so happens I have a book coming out called, it's called Back to Full Employment, and it's coming out soon. So to get the full answer, you should get the book, naturally. You know, for a generation coming out of the Depression, World War II, governments in the US and throughout Europe were committed to variations on the idea of full employment. That was the idea, that was what economic policy was about. How you create decent working conditions for people, how you create opportunity. Why? Because a job is the most important source of income, most important source of security, most important source of being able to participate as a member of your community. So economic policy was about full employment. By the way, it's also the best single anti-poverty program ever invented or conceived of. Not that others aren't useful, but this is the best one. So government policy was committed to that, and so the first and foremost, I would say, is the commitment to return to a policy of full employment. Now, what does that mean over the long term? And there's a lot of things it means, and I'll just mention a couple. In terms of being very strategic, if we take Blinder's point as broadly accurate, and naturally being an academic, I have to have my quibbles with Blinder, but broadly speaking, I think he's making important points. So if we say that 30 to 40 million jobs are open to credible threats by business due to the expansion of the global reserve army, that means that logically it would seem the way to counter that is to increase the proportions of jobs that are not mobile in the economy. That policy should focus on creating a higher proportion of jobs that are not mobile, and that will create more jobs and greater bargaining power for workers. Now, how do you do that? So I'll give you two very explicit examples. One is to increase spending on education. For the most part, yes, we can run courses over the internet, but for the most part, education is the type of employment activity that can only be done on site, that is not going to be outsourced for the most part. And we know that spending on education is being cut through cuts to state and local governments. In fact, when we talk about the austerity agenda being promulgated in Washington now, I think it's more concrete to say this is a austerity around education, or around health care, and around public safety, because that's most of what state and local governments do, and that's where the first cuts are being made. So we need to reverse that. And secondly, building the green economy. Building the green economy is, in addition to addressing the long-term environmental crisis that we face of global warming, it's a highly labor-intensive activity, and almost all the work needs to be done on site. And I'm going to give you some statistics. Let's compare a fossil fuel economy, spending on the fossil fuel economy, with spending on the green economy. If you take $1 million of spending, on average, fossil fuel spending within the fossil fuel economy will create about 5 jobs per $1 million of spending. Spending on the green economy, on average, will create about 17 jobs. So for the same $1 million of spending, when you shift over to the green economy, you create about 3 times more jobs per dollar of expenditure. Okay? Now I'll give you a second example, second comparison. Military spending versus education. When you spend on military, this was my other PowerPoint, transparency, so I'm talking us through it. When you spend on military, you create about 11 jobs in the United States per $1 million of expenditure. Okay. When you spend on education in the United States, you create about 27 jobs per dollar of expenditure. So 2.5 times more jobs per dollar of expenditure spending on education versus the military. So now let's think of a little scenario. Let's take Barney Frank's idea of cutting the military by 25%. And then we'll say, and let's take 25%, that 25% and put it in education. And now let's cut fossil fuel spending by 25% and put that into the green economy. What you would do would be to create about 5 million more jobs in the US economy. About 5 million more jobs that would be located in the United States. And that expansion in 5 million jobs in today's economy would reduce the unemployment rate by 3 percentage points. So if we have roughly a 9% unemployment rate, it would be 6%. And I'm not saying we're going to do this right away. Okay, so this is the long-term agenda. So let's say over the next 2 years, I'd like to be more optimistic, but let's say we're at a 7% unemployment rate. The 7% unemployment rate would go down to 4% by making those two changes, by transferring 25% of today's spending on the military and fossil fuels, moving it into education and the green economy. So that's the kind of way I think that we need to think about creating pressure, counter-pressure against the expansion of the global reserve army of labor. Now, it's not a total solution, but I want to say that when we think that there isn't a solution, that there's no way you can get back to a full employment economy, remind people that in 1999, we actually got close. We were at below a 4% unemployment rate. And that was at a level of globalization roughly comparable to today. Now, the way we got there was because we had a massive financial bubble then, just like the one we most recently had. That one was focused on the stock market. So the challenge that I see is how do we create enough labor market pressure without having to rely on financial bubbles. And the way to do that is to address these points raised by Blinder, which is to stress employment in the United States, create the opportunities in the sectors where the jobs are going to be and where they're going to stay. And again, as two examples, ones that I think are important, are the green economy and education. I will take 2 minutes and just say briefly something about employment in developing countries, and then I'll quit. So the 2-minute version is, one research paper I did with co-authors was to ask this question. When we think about employment in manufacturing employment in developing countries, we said, well, of course it has to be low wages, and that's exerting a lot of downward pressure on employment, on wages in the United States. Now, one of the research, the question we asked was, okay, let's take the most globally mobile, labor-intensive industry where credential levels are not important, and that's the garment industry, and we're manufacturing. So then I asked the question, okay, let's take Mexico, where wages are about 1/10 in the garment industry, 1/10 where they are in the United States. Okay? So then I said, okay, now, what would it take if we doubled the wages, the average wages for workers in Mexico? Doubled. Okay, so right now they're about, well, this was some years ago, but it hasn't changed much. Let's say the wages are about 80 cents an hour. So we do a 100% increase. And how much would that affect if we passed on to consumers 100% of that wage increase? Every penny of it got put back into the price of garments. So if you take the example of men's shirts, the average man's shirt, when I did the study, sold at $32. Okay? And what we found was that if you doubled the wage and you passed it all the way through into the retail price in the United States of men's shirts, the increase in the price that you would have to absorb would be 2%. That means that a $32 shirt in the United States, in order to double the wages and start moving wages into a decent realm for workers in Mexico, would have to be $32.60 instead of $32. Minimal increase, probably almost not noticeable by consumers. Now, what that tells me, there's a lot more to say, but I'll stop. What that tells me is there is a huge opportunity for creating decent labor standards in developing countries and making those consonant with well-being in the United States, where we are also focusing on decent conditions and full employment. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Just for those of us watching or listening at home, you are listening to the Cambridge Forum, and that was Robert Pollin of UMass Amherst. Let me take, and I'm Bob Cutner, your moderator. Let me take a question or two for myself, and then let me throw it open to the audience. So I want to push you a little bit on the degree to which, excuse me, this is a labor market story versus a political economy story. And of course, the answer is both, but let's try to unpack it. So you can tell a very powerful story, as you just have, of race to the bottom kinds of pressures being caused by the fact that labor markets are now global. And there's a reserve army of hundreds of millions of people willing to perform work that has historically been performed in the United States at much lower wages. No question about it. There's a second dimension of this going on, it seems to me, and I'd like you to address that. If you go back to the period after World War II, I would argue that there was a kind of a harmonic convergence that made this almost a unique period in the history of capitalism and democracy. The government in the United States, a libertarian country, was uniquely prestigious because it had cured the Depression and then it had won the war. Big business was disgraced for having caused the Depression. In the countries that had been occupied by Nazi Germany and in Germany itself, much of big business was further disgraced as having been collaborators. And even center-right parties were Christian democratic parties that believed in a mixed economy, and trade unions were strong. And in the United States, the percentage of goods traded was around 5%. So you had all of the conditions structurally and politically that made it possible to regulate capitalism in one country. And even under those circumstances, it was an uphill fight, because in a market economy, the people who have the most money have the most power. So for 30 years, the rest of us pretty much fought these guys to a draw, and we had an economy where wages rose in tandem with productivity. Enter globalization. Globalization undermines the ability of one democratic country to regulate a market economy in the public interest. So I'm sure those of us on the panel could complement, in both senses of the word, Bob's agenda and come up with ways of having a more equal labor market. But would the political circumstances permit us to do it? And if not, what do we do about that?
Okay, thanks for the easy softball question. Yeah, well, Bob Cutner is a brilliant guy. I've been reading his work for a long, long time, so naturally I wouldn't expect him to come up with an easy question. You know, Bob's of course right. I mean, coming out of out of the Depression and World War II, the let's say political compromise around creating a full employment economy did not come out of thin air. It came out of specific historical circumstances, and those historical circumstances obviously changed. And the question now is, how do we get them to change back again? It was certainly the case that after the Wall Street crash and the Great Recession, it seemed to me that, you know, a much more favorable political moment had arrived in which the imperative of fighting for full employment and of putting strong regulations on financial markets had arrived. And moreover, the idea of directing a significant amount of the country's productive resources into building a green economy. I would have to say realistically that I don't think that that moment is still here, not at least right now. It could come back. I don't really have an answer other than to say, if we don't do this, we are going to continue down this path where conditions continue to deteriorate for the majority, where we come back to a situation in which financial markets become extremely unstable, and we'll be back in the same mess we were in. So the real challenge, political challenge, if I want to get very concrete, it seems to me, unfortunately has to come through the Democratic Party, which I think is a fairly feeble tool. But to exert pressure on the Democratic Party, essentially the same way that the Tea Party has exerted pressure on the right to the Republican Party. They've been very successful in moving the Republican Party to the insane right. And what I would like to see is the Democratic Party moving increasingly towards the sane left. Now, I don't know how we do that. I think we just keep working at it. So I don't have a better answer. Sorry.
Let me pursue this at the global level.
Okay.
So your Mexico example is very powerful. The New York Times a few weeks ago, in its piece on Foxconn, which makes Apple toys, pointed out that if you agreed to raise the cost of an iPad, $60, you could pay workers at Foxconn $20 an hour and bring that work home. So again, the political question, it seems to me, either at the national level, where countries that are democracies or quasi-democracies, in theory, have some control over the rules of the game, or at the international level, where the International Labor Organization has been trying for almost a century now to get basic labor standards adopted, and this is more and more important as the world becomes one big labor market. What do you think we might do on that front in terms of international norms, either brokered at the level of nation by nation or brokered at the level of global agreements by official bodies, by unofficial watchdog bodies, by consumer bodies, by international labor federations? What hope can you give us on that front?
Okay, well, the research that I cited on Mexico that I did really came out of people that were involved in the anti-sweatshop movement, mainly college students. And I was actually ridiculed by fellow academics for saying, oh, what are these students? They don't know anything. And yes, the jobs are bad, but they're much better. So if I want to pick on Paul Krugman again, I think a quote from about 10 years ago was, the expansion of sweatshops is tremendous good news for the world's poor. Why? Because they said, okay, the sweatshop jobs are better than, obviously they're showing up at work, so they're better than the alternative. Now, but the real answer is that, what capitalism is doing in the developing world, including China, including India, is it is destroying opportunities in the rural sectors, but it isn't creating decent opportunities in the urban sectors, and that's why, yes, a sweatshop job does look good. Now, the question then is, the international movement, anti-sweatshop movement, I think was reasonably effective. And, why are we reading an article about Foxconn in the New York Times? Because Apple Computer doesn't want to have its image destroyed. And that's the only reason. And it was the same thing with Nike. I mean, they didn't care. Obviously, they didn't care about who was producing their sneakers or their iPads. But if consumers care, then if consumers get organized, it'll filter up, and then we'll have global conferences and agreements, and maybe it'll do some good. So that's really, I think it's a movement at the grassroots.
All right. We're going to go to audience questions. So go to the microphone, and we'll start with Professor Ellen Rosen.
The whole thing seems to me that it's really predicted by globalization. The trade agreements like NAFTA and WTO, if we could work on that, it would be really good, because then we go back to one country and we could solve the problems.
So you're saying that the trade agreements would Yeah.
Because, I mean, if you have people going to another country to do everything, like Pakistan, the paralysis is nothing. I mean, we've accepted that. I don't think that's really been changed or has done anything. There was a little noise at one point, but I don't think it's really changed. They're still making garments in Bangladesh. They go to lower and lower wage places.
Right.
So, I mean, if you could just change but if the one could just change the globalization, that would be it.
Well, I think that there is, to some extent, globalization is a reality and it's not going away. And so the point is how we manage it, whether we like it or not. And so the idea of establishing decent labor standards and fighting for those at a global scale, I think, to me, that's a better route. Yes, there's certainly, as I said, there is a huge amount of pressure. Whatever the labor standards say, people will avoid them or go to a country where there's lower labor standards. But the counter pressure is to, invest in this country. If we build infrastructure, if we invest in infrastructure, as Obama keeps talking about, and as Bob Kuttner has written about Obama's commitments in this and other areas, that creates a lot of jobs in the United States. So we have to say that that is an important counter pressure. And if we have decent labor standards, as I said, but I forgot to mention, in the late 90s, when we did have something close to a full employment economy briefly for a year and a half, 2 years, due to the bubble, wages did actually rise, even at the bottom. In fact, especially at the bottom. So if we create that pressure, and if there's a political commitment to sustain that pressure, I think we will see an improvement, even when we have a highly integrated economy.
Well, I was just fantasizing a little bit. I was thinking about what would happen if they took Foxconn and brought all the jobs back here. You could train people to do them. You could work an 8-hour day and 3-hour shifts. Why doesn't anyone think of that?
Well, we could think of that. I would just add, and I think maybe Rob, Scott, and I would have a small difference on this, so I'll just toss it out. I mean, I think workers in China should have jobs. I think workers in Bangladesh should have, I know Rob thinks that too. But I'm not against the workers in China, Bangladesh, Mexico. I don't think they're stealing our jobs. I think they should have good jobs. I think the global economy needs to balance. I think you are starting to see some upward wage pressure in China, by the way. And if that continues, you will start to see an expansion of the domestic market in China, which is good. It's good in terms of trade balances, and maybe Rob is going to talk about that. And it's good in terms of job creation and opportunities in the United States. So the big global solution is for the developing countries to start building their growth engines on the basis of having workers getting paid decently in a decent market in those countries.
Yeah.
Four one-sentence comment questions, and at least one of which is lighthearted. So is Alan Blinder a Marxist? Secondly, wouldn't the responsible thing also be to do something to manage immigration and migrant labor, and what would that be? And what does the handling of Van Jones tell us about the Obama administration's commitment to the green jobs agenda? Is Obama the answer in the next election? And that's relating to something that Bob was asking about. And finally, what do Europe do any differently that we could learn from?
What could Europe do?
Or what do they do?
Oh, what do they do? Okay, Alan Blinder is definitely a Marxist. I know he's hiding all his communist books somewhere. Immigration, actually, if you look on balance, immigration into the United States is not causing job loss. I know that sounds counterintuitive. I'll refer to the work of someone whose work I respect a lot, David Card at UC Berkeley. Other people have shown similar results. But what Carr did was actually compare cities in the United States where most immigrants work and compared the low-wage labor market, natives versus immigrants, okay? And then he compares cities that have a high proportion of immigrants versus cities that have a low proportion. So to take an example, compare Philadelphia and Atlanta versus New York and Los Angeles. And if immigrants were really causing the downward pressure on wages, you would tend to see wages depressed more in Los Angeles and New York versus, say, Atlanta and Philadelphia, where immigrants are much lower percentage. And you just don't see it. He did the research in 2000. I myself updated his research just for the recession. You still don't see it. Now, the reason is that, you know, large populations of immigrants don't just increase the supply of workers, they also increase the demand for products. And so that is, and they also attract, if you think of Miami or LA, they also attract foreign investment. So we don't see that. So I actually did write an article, I have this column in New Labor Forum, and the article was titled, "Can We Please Stop Blaming Immigrants?" Van Jones and Obama. Obama is a politician, let's face it, okay? So it's up to us to move the politicians, whether Obama or anybody else. As politicians go, I think he's probably, in my opinion, he's pretty good as politicians. Certainly a lot better than the alternative that we're looking at in November. But I never had high hopes for Obama per se. I had high hopes for a movement that is going to push Obama in the right direction, and that's how I still feel. Europe. Well, Europe's in pretty bad shape. What are the positive lessons? Well, Europe, up until this crisis, maintained a much better labor market conditions. Now, the argument about that was, well, yeah, they've got that, but then they have much higher unemployment rate, and that's the problem in Europe. Now, I'll cite the work of a good friend of mine, David Howell, who did enormous research demonstrating that actually if you compare countries across Europe, there's wide variation in Europe between how heavy the labor standards are and the costs and so forth. And Howell and his co-authors found that actually in essentially comparing Northern Europe, Nordic countries, with the rest of Europe, they do not have inferior levels of employment. They do not have higher rates of unemployment, even though they have a much stronger welfare state. So you can build a strong welfare state and sustain it. That's the evidence that I see from Europe.
On the same line, how can we sustain a global economy based on our version of capitalism, where it's quite predatory and it creates one bubble after another? And it basically responds to the demands of the financial sector for ever-growing companies without end. You constantly have to grow, and you constantly have to attract investors. If you don't make a quarter that has significantly improved from the past, you're not going to attract them. How can we develop a capitalism with a conscience towards those that are fueling it, which is the workers, the people that buy, and not produce things that are going to inflame the public and say, oh yeah, we're going to buy this humongous house, which is basically built in a hurry and is not going to sustain the hurricanes that are coming our way, especially in an economy where the basic natural resources are going to lack. Water, number one, fossil fuels, and others. And the land mass is going to diminish, for cultivation.
Well, there's only one answer, and it doesn't get to your ecological part. And you'll see that this answer is not really an answer, but the only way is through persistent financial bailouts to the financial sector. And I don't want to, I'm not being glib here. We cannot underestimate the centrality of financial bailouts to sustaining the version of capitalism you just described. If it hadn't been for the bailouts this last time, we would be in a situation worse than the 1930s right now. And we had the bailout, after the previous bubble, In fact, we had the bailout in 1997, and the 97-98 bailout, after that, there was a cover story in Time magazine, back when Time magazine mattered a lot. And the cover was the Committee to Save the World. And it was a picture of three people. And it was Robert Rubin, Larry Summers, and Alan Greenspan. They were the Committee to Save the World. And actually, it was true. They were saving the capitalist world by bailing out the financial market from its excesses and its destructive behavior. So short of that, of course, you know, we would be in, like I said, we would really be in the soup now. Now, the real answer is to create a version of capitalism that does not rely on financial bubbles for growth and does not rely on bailouts to prevent massive depressions. And how to get there, now that, as Bob said, you know, that's a political question. I can think of ways that I've described a little bit, ways that I can think about how to do it analytically, how to do it in terms of economic policy, but how do we develop financial regulations to prevent bailouts? I mean, we are still struggling over that day after day, 2 years after the Dodd-Frank financial regulatory laws were passed. Now, Congress knew when they passed them that they were very vague, and they were giving all kinds of leverage to the financial industry to help write the details. And that's the struggle that's going on right now. So that's the kind of thing we need to have a political movement and people committed, essentially channeling, for better or worse, through the Democratic Party to fight around these things.
Quick follow-up, and then we got one more gentleman, then we have to.
Yeah. You mentioned some European countries, mostly in the Nordic areas. Could you comment on that as being a potential blueprint for a change?
I think that is the blueprint for change, in my view. If I may quote from my former revered professor, Robert Heilbronner, if many of you heard of him, he wrote The Worldly Philosophers, a classic book on economics. His version of what was feasible, he called it slightly imaginary Sweden. And I think if we think about slightly imaginary Sweden as a goal for the United States, we'd be doing okay.
Last question.
Spending money on education is the way forward, but what type of skills should be developed? So what should the labor market look like from a skill perspective?
Okay, well, one thing I'll say on skills, you know, one of the arguments that's being promulgated pretty prominently now is, of course, the reason unemployment rate is falling so weakly is because people don't have the skills for the new economy, and businesses can't hire them. Well, I don't buy that, because, you know, it was 2007, before the crisis, you know, the unemployment rate was 5%, not 9%. So all of a sudden, the people's skills evaporated? I don't really think that's true. Now, when we think about the green economy, people also say, well, it's an entirely new world. They're going to have to get all these new skills. Well, one of Bob cited one of the studies I did, Job Opportunities for a Green Economy. Well, you really break it down. Of course, there are, you know, to put in solar panels is different than putting in windows and wiring in a house. But, you know, it's not like this is an entirely new world that we're talking about. I think there have to be incremental improvements. And, you know, a skill retraining is a good thing, but I don't think the skill problem is really the thing that's holding back decent job opportunities. I think it's politics. I think it's building a full employment economy and making that commitment, and then we build a new framework for skill acquisition around that.
Thank you. All right. Thanks to Robert Pollin